Hey there, it's Rebecca from Bryan House Quilts. In this video, I'm going to teach you how to sew an improvisational curve. I use improvisational curve piecing all the time in my improv work. Here's an example of how I've used improv curves to make this black and white piece. I've also used improvisational curve piecing in more complex pieces, like this one. By the end of this video, I hope that you have an idea of how to sew an improvisational curve. Let's get started. Okay, so I've done these, and now I have these blocks left to do. So if these are each blocks, then there are 6 times 4 or 24 blocks in the entire quilt, and I've done 12, so I need to do these 12. I'm actually going to focus on doing this one first because this one is pretty straightforward and it'll allow me to show you how to do improv curves. So yeah, this is the one I'm going to focus on today. So when I start making these blocks, I want to kind of rein in the size. So what I've been doing to help control the size is to start with one black and one white square of fabric. And the square is about 11 by 10 or 10 by 10. All right, I've got my fabric pressed and ready to go. Okay, so again, I'm working on this square, and I want to see how making this square into fabric, how that changes the overall look of the design. And in the process, I'm going to show you how to piece improvisational curves. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut for this line right here. And there's a couple ways you can do your cutting. You can do cut, sew, cut, sew, cut, sew, cut, sew. And so every time you cut, you're going to your sewing machine and then you're coming back to the cutting board and doing another cut. Since this block is so straightforward, I'm going to go ahead and try to just do all my cuts at once and do all my sewing at one time. Okay, so I'm going to cut for this curve right here. So I'm just gonna kind of eyeball it, and I'm not really concerned with getting it exactly how it is in my sketch. Remember, I'm just concerned with how the sketch is translated to fabric and how my hand as a maker influences that line. Now I've stacked my fabric, and then I'm going to make a cut with my rotary cutter. And you can see me kind of trying to do a rough draft with my hand here. So I think I've got my rough draft, and now I'm pretty confident in my rough draft, so I'm gonna go ahead and cut. All the while remembering it's just fabric, and if I don't like it, I can redo it. Okay, so here's the first curve that I would be sewing. And remember, when you put these through the sewing machine, you're going to lose about 1/2 inch from the seam allowance. So your fabric is going to shrink as you sew it together. Okay, so I've got my first cut. I'm going to stack the black on the bottom this time because I want to watch how the white looks. So I've got my black fabric on the bottom. I'm just going to stack this one on top just so I can see how it's looking. And I'm going to make another cut right here. So I'm going to do this second line right here. And I'm just kind of getting a sense of the line. So it kind of goes up and then it wiggles in and then it shoots off again. So that looks like it starts maybe almost 1/3 of the way through. Okay, so I'm going to go here. I'm going to wiggle this way and wiggle that way. Okay. One thing I've noticed as I've been piecing my blocks is that my curves with the rotary cutter end up being very, very smooth compared to my my sketches over here. So as I've been working, I've been trying to be conscious of that because I don't like how smooth it is. I want to make it a little bit more gritty and choppy here. And I say that because I felt that this line is really smooth. And I'm not sure if I like that. Okay, now I've got that curve. My next task is to make this curve. Doing this line, and it kind of follows, and then it really veers. All right, follows and then veers. I've got one more cut to make. All right, so we have all of our pieces for this block. And the cool thing about cutting this way, remember I said you could cut, or you could cut and sew, cut and sew, cut and sew. Well, the cool thing about just cutting is that I've got enough fabric to make a second version, which would be like a negative, a photo negative. So, I mean, that's one cool thing. I'm not going to make my negative one, but I mean, you could if you wanted to, right? All right, so these are the extras, these are the negatives. Okay, so these are the pieces that we'll be sewing together to make our curved improvisationally pieced quilt block. So in a minute, I'm going to show you what it actually looks like going through my sewing machine, but I want to give you a preview of how you're going to match the curves together. These curves right here are going to be the easiest, I think. And then the curves with this hook right here, they're going to be more challenging. And then this one in the middle is going to be probably pretty easy, but we'll call it medium. So whenever I sew curves, and whenever you sew curves, you're supposed to keep the convex piece on the bottom. So if we're working with these two pieces first, this piece, the convex piece, would go on the bottom, and then the concave piece, this one, would go on the top. And whenever I do pieces that don't quite fit together, I always look for where the seam is going to go. So I can see that my 1/4 inch seam is gonna go right here, and I always try, if I want my sides to match up really closely, then I'm looking for this divot right here, and this divot will need to be right where the 1/4 inch seam is going to cross the fabric. So that's where I start lining up my piece. Now I don't use pins whenever I do improvisational piecing. Pinning is not something I enjoy, but I want to give you a preview of what the fabric's going to look like as it goes through the machine. And when you send it through the machine, you want to make sure that there's no puckers in the seam line. And that's what I'm going to be doing now by pinning. I'm going to show you how you can finagle the fabric. And I'm just using my thumbs to stretch the fabric on top to meet with the fabric on the bottom. So I'm just using the pins to finagle the fabric so that I don't have any puckers. And if you are relatively new to curve piecing or improv piecing, you might consider pinning. And I like pinning because it allows me to get all the puckers out of my fabric before I send it through the machine. It looks like there might be a potential pucker here. So I'm flattening this out with my thumb, and then I'm adding the pin. Okay. Now I've got this piece ready to go through the sewing machine. And remember, I've got it pinned, but normally I wouldn't do any pinning typically with improvisation. It's just not something I enjoy, but I pinned it for this demonstration in order to show you that as I'm going along the seam line, I want to be sure that I avoid any puckers that might arise. So I've pinned it so there shouldn't be any puckers. Okay, so I've got this piece all sewed up and I'm ready to take it to my pressing station and press it. I've got these pieces that are already sewn, and I want to show you how I press these. And when I press these pieces of fabric, I'm usually trying to press to the black part of the seam allowance. So because I don't want the black showing through on the white side, I'm always pressing when I can to the black. Okay, so how I do it is I put my sewn strip set here, I put it on my ironing board. And what I'm doing is I'm first going to press the seam to set it just like you would in regular piecing. So I've set the seam, and now I'm gonna finger press it now. And I'm not pressing the seam open, I'm pressing it to the dark side. And once I've got it finger pressed, I'm going to press it with my iron. Now, typically when you're piecing, you don't want to press, you don't want to iron like this. Instead, you want to pick it up and set it down so you're pressing. Now, in improvisational piecing, I sometimes like to break this rule to see how far I can stretch any bias in the fabric. I find that sometimes that gives me some really interesting looking lines. So it might be something you want to try in your own improvisational piecing. Now I'm going to show you what it looks like when I sew these pieces together and I don't do any pinning. And as I mentioned, I don't like to pin. I don't enjoy it, so I avoid it at all costs. So I've got two pieces I want to sew together, and this is one of the trickier ones because I've got this pivot right here. So I'll show you what I do. And if you've never heard of a tool like this is a stiletto, and this one in particular is by Alex Anderson, and it has a seam ripper on one side and a stiletto on another side. So what a stiletto will do for you is allow you to poke your fabric through your sewing machine without risking injury to your precious fingers. So a stiletto is a good tool to have on hand. Other options are a chopstick or a porcupine quill would work too. So I'm going to keep this close by just in case I need it. Okay, so this is what I do when I take my improv curves over to my sewing machine. And as I mentioned before, what I do to start with is find this little divot right here. So this is where the seam line, this is where the seam will go. So I'm looking for where the fabric intersects right here and where it crosses. So that's where I'm going to start. And I'm going to kind of try to get the fabric ready to curve. Okay, so needle down. And it's not necessary to backstitch, but I just do it out of force of habit. So I'm going to sew. I've got a nice clean, I've got a nice while before I really have to do anything. So I'm going to sew for a couple of inches. Okay, I'm going to stop, and my needle's down. And now I'm coming up to this pivot in the fabric, so I really have to work the fabric to behave. And what I'm doing now is I'm using my fingers as pins, and you can see where a stiletto might be a good option. So I've got my fingers I'm using them as pins, and I'm going to sew a little bit. And I feel a little pucker, so I'm going to stop. I'm going to lift my foot, my sewing foot here. I'm also taking my foot off the pedal, and that way I'm taking my actual foot, this foot, off the sewing machine pedal so I don't accidentally sew myself. And what I'm doing is I'm stroking the fabric to get rid of that pucker. And I think I've done it. So sewing machine foot down, my foot back on the sewing machine pedal, and I'm going to proceed. And my fabrics aren't lining up precisely, and that's okay, as long as there's no puckers. Another trick you can do is try to keep the fabric as straight as possible. So notice I've got it as straight as I possibly can. Okay, I've passed the hard part. Now, again, I'm just using my fingers as pins. But I'm being sure that I don't let my fingers go too closely to the sewing machine needle. So let's see, I don't feel a pucker right now, but let's just say I do feel a pucker and I need to really put my finger really close to the needle. I would stop and I would use the stiletto to feed the fabric through. Okay, that's how I use a stiletto. Okay, we're almost done. Okay, I'm trying to make the fabric as straight as I can. Okay, I've got a little curve to finish off at the end, so I need my stiletto. Okay. Okay, so I'm done with this seam, and now I'm just looking over my work to make sure that I didn't get a pucker, and I don't have a pucker. I do have a fold, but that will press out, so I'm not worried about that, but no puckers, so I'm ready to take this over to my pressing station. So that's my general process for piecing improvisational curves. So I hope that this tutorial has given you some ideas on how to use curve piecing, improvisational curve piecing, in your own works. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them if you leave them in the comments section below. If you like this video and learned something from this video, I would love it if you would hit the like button. You can also subscribe to my channel by hitting the subscribe button down in the corner. Okay, that's all I have for you today. Thanks so much for tuning in, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!